sounds.
This is the BBC World Service, looking at climate change.
A climate study endorsed by 11,000 scientists warns there'll be
How do we deal with the challenge of climate change?
Each week, we'll talk to our journalists on the ground and hear how the crisis is unfolding before their eyes.
And we'll be bringing together leading experts to hear how we might make a better future.
Join Neil Rozelle and Greer Jackson for The Climate Question, Monday at 9:20 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Sporting Witness.
We're going back to 1970. During a Springboks tour of the British Isles, anti-apartheid campaigners caused so much disruption that teams from South Africa were later banned from the UK until the end of white minority rule.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm James Copnell, and this edition of World Questions comes from Sudan. At the height of the country's revolution last year, huge crowds of mainly young protesters took control of the streets around the military headquarters in the capital Khartoum. They chanted for freedom, peace and justice. They mourned the dead in Sudan's numerous civil wars, debated the country's future, and faced down the military which had been in power for 30 years. Many were killed along the way, in Khartoum and throughout the country. But the protesters won. The soldier president was overthrown and the military establishment made way, at least part of the way, when a transitional government was set up. And yet the challenges were only just beginning. Join me, our panel of leading figures from Sudan and some lively questioners from across the country at this key moment on its transition to democracy. That's World Questions, right after the BBC World Service News.
Hello, this is Danielle Jałowiecka with the BBC News. In the past few minutes, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said that talks on the future trading relations between the EU and Britain will continue. She was speaking shortly after her conversation with the British Prime Minister.
I had a constructive and useful phone call with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. We discussed the major unsolved topics. Our negotiation teams have been working day and night over the recent days, and despite the exhaustion after almost 1 year of negotiations, and despite the fact that deadlines have been missed over and over, we both think that it is responsible at this point in time to go the extra mile. We have accordingly mandated our negotiators to continue the talks and to see whether an agreement can be reached, even at this late stage. The negotiations continue here in Brussels.
Chancellor Merkel has announced tighter coronavirus restrictions that will apply across Germany over the holiday period after reaching agreement with all 16 states. Schools and non-essential shops will close from Wednesday until at least the 10th of January. Households will only be able to invite up to 4 other people from close family circles for 3 days over Christmas. Mrs. Merkel explained why the decision was taken.
Haben wir seit einigen Tagen wieder steigende Fallzahlen und ein exponentielles Wachstum.
In the past few days, we've seen again an increase in cases and exponential growth. And that means that we're mourning a lot of deaths. We know the health system is already very heavily burdened, and our task, our aim, was always to avoid overloading it. So there is an urgent need for action.
Besteht dringender Handlungsbedarf und daraus resultieren.
The Afghan Defence Ministry says more than 60 Taliban fighters have been killed in fierce fighting with security forces in the southern province of Kandahar. The two sides are involved in peace negotiations. Here's Anbarasan Etirajan.
The Afghan security forces have launched a heavy air and ground assault to repel Taliban advances in at least 5 districts surrounding the city of Kandahar. Local residents said the fighting continued several hours through the night. The Defense Ministry says Taliban has suffered heavy losses, but there are no details of government casualties. Elsewhere in Kandahar, in the district of Arghandab, residents said at least 7 members of a family, including 4 children, were killed in airstrikes. On Saturday, several rockets hit the capital Kabul, killing 1 person and disrupting operations at the international airport for a few hours.
World News from the BBC. Protests are continuing in Belarus, demanding the resignation of the country's long-standing authoritarian leader Alexander Lukashenko. Small, dispersed groups have gathered in different parts of the capital, Minsk, as the opposition use different tactics from the large-scale marches seen every Sunday in the first months of protests. Iran has summoned the ambassador of Germany, which currently holds the European Union presidency, after the EU issued a strong condemnation of the execution of the dissident journalist Ruhollah Zam. Iranian media outlets say that the foreign ministry also plans to summon the French ambassador. France described the hanging of Zam on Saturday as barbaric and unacceptable. 4 people are in hospital in Washington with stab wounds after clashes at rallies for and against President Trump. David Willis reports.
Tensions rose after dark as members of the right-wing group, the Proud Boys, fought with Black Lives Matter sympathisers and members of the left-wing group Antifa. Police used pepper spray. More than 20 people are thought to have been arrested, and reports suggest some were treated for stab wounds. The Stop the Steal rally had been called to support Donald Trump's unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud. Intended as a show of force just 2 days before the Electoral College meets to formally elect Joe Biden as the next US president, it brought thousands onto the streets of the nation's capital in support.
Malaysia's maritime agency says it's intercepted the country's largest ever haul of crystal meth, seizing more than $26 million worth of the drug from a speedboat. The pilot of the boat jumped overboard after a 30-minute chase but was later arrested. On board, officers discovered 2 tons of methamphetamine hidden inside packets of Chinese tea. BBC News.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm James Copnell, and welcome to World Questions, the programme which puts the public right at the heart of the debate. And this month, some of Sudan's new leaders and opinion formers will be debating issues put to them from questioners across the country, gathered with the help of our partners, the British Council. In 2019, Sudan's military president Omar al-Bashir was overthrown after nearly 30 years in power. The peaceful protesters were angry about the collapsing economy, human rights abuses, and the civil wars that continued to weaken the country. Bashir was wanted by the International Criminal Court. Sudan was a pariah. No longer. A transitional civilian and military administration has been set up to restore the country's image and take it to elections. The challenges it faces are huge. The economy continues to deteriorate, and many question whether the military is really ready to give up power. There's much to debate, and we have a great panel to take on issues posed by the Sudanese public. So let me introduce our panel, starting with Sudan's acting foreign minister, Omar Ismail. Omar is from the Darfur region of Sudan and for many years worked in exile to bring the human rights abuses in his homeland to the attention of the world, before returning after the revolution to take on this senior role. Does it still feel good to be back in Sudan, Omar?
For sure, after being away for 30 years.
Another strong voice in cabinet meetings and on this panel is Wala Issam Al-Bushi. She's the Minister for Youth and Sports and the youngest member of the cabinet. She was very active in the street protests and is the self-declared Minister for the Revolution. Well, that's quite a title and quite a responsibility.
Yes, of course. So thank you, Mr. James, for having us today.
Our pleasure. Mohamed Naji al-Assam played a prominent role in the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, reading out a revolutionary declaration on social media at some personal cost. He then spent months in jail. He's now a nominee to the Transition Partners Council, a senior body intended to resolve differences on Sudan's path to democracy. You're also a doctor during a pandemic, Mohammed. You must be extremely busy.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, James, for having me, and hello for everyone.
Finally, Reem Abbas is an award-winning blogger on human rights and current affairs in Sudan, as well as being a respected journalist for many national and international outlets. Welcome, Reem. Plenty to write about these days in Sudan, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So much happening at the same time.
Well, let's get to our first question, which comes from Tutu Ramhino, a community worker from the Nuba Mountains. Tutu.
Thank you for having me. I have questions. We, the youths in Nuba Mountains, suffer from unemployment even after completion of school education. we still believe Bashir has great influence in key decision making. So my question is, how do you plan to instill confidence in us to believing in the new regime when criminals like al-Bashir stays in prison mansion? Thank you.
Thank you, Tutu. Great question. Couple of parts to it, really, there. Unemployment, living standards. How do you make things better? And also the influence of the former president Omar al-Bashir and his generals and so on may still have on affairs. Wala, you're the Minister for Youth and Sports. Tutu wants to know, how do you encourage youthful people like him, young people like him, that there will be a job for them?
Okay, so thank you, Tutu, for your question. Yes, unemployment is a major challenge worldwide, even for big economies, not only for Sudan. Now, in our ministry, we are developing a youth policy that will tackle the different areas of interest for the young people of Sudan, like youth employment, education, political participation, and so on. We have a big fund up from the African Development Bank to encourage youth to have their own agricultural businesses. Also, we are developing innovation centers across the country where we can, that will help the youth on building their capacities. Employment is a big challenge, but yes, we are working on it, and we will be there, inshallah.
Mohammed Naji El-Assam, you were one of the youthful faces of the revolution. What can you say to convince Tutu that there will be jobs for people like him?
Yes, thank you. And I would like also to thank Tutu for his question and his remarks. The youth and their trust in their transitional authority right now is diminishing gradually, I think, mainly due to the change that they want to see and that are not here till now. Regarding the issue of jobs, I think it's linked completely to the state of the economy. The Sudanese economy is in crisis, and it was aggravated also by the pandemic this year. And the transition itself is a chaotic period for any nation, as you may know. And so we are not yet to see really any real transformation in our economy. Actually, the situation is deteriorating, and you cannot find new jobs or create new jobs without having a stable economy and a progressing economy. So it's directly linked to the economy, and we hope as we get over this pandemic, things will get better.
Reem Abbas, there's a second part in a way to Tutu's question, wasn't there? He still believes that Omar al-Bashir, former president, perhaps those who were close to him in the old government, still have great influence over decision-making. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And the current military leaders were part of the former regime, and it is an establishment that controls the resources and public funds. It's not in the it was not given back to the Ministry of Finance. So the old regime still has control of a lot of resources. Some companies that are affiliated with the NCP, the National Congress Party, the former regime, still have government contracts, and this is very evident in the aviation industry, for example. So a very big problem that comes from fighting the deep state or the old regime is basically to take control of the funds, the resources that they use to continue to buy loyalty, that they use to continue to sabotage this period. And this is very problematic because we're seeing right now that the Ministry of Finance, for example, is unable to make projections or even to increase production, which is our way out because they don't control a lot of the public funds that are still in the hands of the military establishment, the old regime. And another critical problem is the lack of information. There's a lot of lack of credible information for the government to be able to make decisions. The last census was 10 years ago. We don't have credible information of poverty levels, demographic changes, and this is why a lot of the programs that were proposed by the ministry to kind of alleviate this problem and also to reclaim some of the resources that are still in the hands of the old regime are not going very well.
Omer, acting foreign minister, you are part of a technocratic civilian cabinet. And yet there's also the Sovereign Council that replaces the presidency above you with military men on that body. So how much power do you have? Does to take Tutu's question, Bashir, still have great influence over the work you're able to do?
I beg to differ, because the civilian government is still able to make their own decisions. There could be some remnants of the government of Bashir that is still with us, represented in the Sovereign Council. However, we believe that we were governed by the constitutional document, and this is a document that the Sudanese people agreed to and accepted. And we don't want to give any indication to the world that there are two governments in Sudan, because they aren't. There is just one government. We disagree over specific issues. They go out of the prescription at times, and they have their own contacts with different elements, and at times even can intervene in my work as an acting foreign minister. But that must not be seen as Bashir governing through them from his cell in Cobra jail. That is untrue. There is a lot of will and a lot of determination in the civilian part of this government to take matters in their hands. We go to work every day, and we work as hard as we can, not only to run our ministries, but also to work with the Sovereign Council, as difficult as at times that relationship might be. It is not the normal thing that dominates our work every day. That is just part of what we do, and that is how we run the country. And it is not going to be easy when you take over from a government that was corrupt and left the economy in tatters.
Tutu, you heard all those answers. What do you think?
I think the way they've answered the question is not satisfactory, because we feel Omar al-Bashir should be where he belongs. He should be in Hague.
You feel he should be in The Hague, facing charges for the International Criminal Court?
Yeah, I think that's the first approach to have us have confidence in the new regime.
Tutu, thank you so much indeed. We're going to move on to another question. So many great questions to get through. And our next questioner is Solafa Hassan, an architectural consultant. Solafa.
Hello, and thank you for having me. I'm glad to be part of this conversation with our leaders towards a better Sudan. We do feel the great effort that the government exerts to reintegrate Sudan back into the world. However, we're deeply worried that the lack of agreement on how to manage the economy and the blame game between the different government agencies have casted a shadow on the performance of the transitional government. This in turn may pose a threat to the democracy that we've all fought for. What are the practical steps that the transitional government will take to reach the sought-for consensus so it can boost the sluggish performance? Thank you.
Thank you, Solafa. A need for consensus, she says, need to get rid of disagreements within different parts of the government. And there has been disagreement in the last few days on a new Transition Partners Council that would have generals and rebel leaders, also protest leaders, intended to smooth over differences, or perhaps, as some perhaps within the military, it's been reported, wants that to replace some of the institutions set up by the agreement signed at the end of the revolution. So, new body that not everybody likes. And Mohammed, you were a nominee for this body. Too much disharmony among different government bodies. What do you say?
Yeah, I think this is one of the issues that was very clear during the last year, that in a lot of issues you would find the different parts of the authority disagreeing. We have seen that during the period of negotiating the normalization with Israel, among other issues as well. And this new body, this new council is intended to just solve these conflicts that can arise between the different entities. And it will be the formal link between the Forces for Freedom and Change, the political coalition backing up the government, and the governmental bodies, also armed rebel movements who signed the Juba Peace Agreement. We need this body to, as you said, to smooth these conflicts that definitely will arise during the transitional period. It will not replace any authority. Of course, it shouldn't have any executive or legislative authority whatsoever.
So that sounds like a body designed to help. So why, Minister Omer, was the Cabinet against this? As we record this on Wednesday, the 9th of December, we've seen in the last couple of days the Cabinet and other bodies coming out pretty strongly against the Transition Partners Council, or at least the powers granted to it.
I mean, on the outset, say that the Council is not against it. The Council is against the powers that was given, because this was not what we agreed to in our discussion between the Council of Ministers and the Sovereign Council. Both of us constitute the legislative body in the absence of the Constitutional Assembly. However, going to the larger question, transitions are always messy. This is a government that took power for only 1 year from a government that was there for 30 years, and the way that the business was done was completely different than what we aspire to do here. And that is normal, because you're bringing people that never worked together, and you're bringing different ideas, even though maybe the ideology or the way of thinking or the vision for the future is the same. However, we are all individuals at the end of the day. This not to say that this is an excuse for lack of harmony, but we are working on it, and we are, trying as best as we can to be able to move all these moving parts in the right direction and become one government with one idea and one vision.
Well, let's turn to another part of that government. Minister Wella, do you agree with the central thrust of Salafa's question that divergences in views within the government, tensions within the government, have led to sluggish performance, have hurt the economy, might even threaten democracy?
I completely agree with what Salafa has said. You know what? Because we've been disagreeing between lifting subsidies or remaining, the subsidies. This discussion lasts for almost 1 year. As well, we need to understand the actual situation. Like when the government took over, what we had was only $52 million. What we need only for subsidies is $128 million. What we need in 1 month is $450 million. And we don't have any resources, to have this kind of budget monthly. So putting in mind the challenges that we already have and the disagreement led to this, the economic crisis that we have now, the long queues in gas station, and people even now they are suffering to have their basic living needs. So I agree with Salafa, it's going to affect the democracy, because now frustration and anger is getting higher and higher, and also because of Sudan and the list of sponsoring terrorism, we can add to that the debts, which is up to $60 billion. So it's very messy, challenges are so much, but I think one of the areas that we both, at the government and at the Forces of Freedom and Change, that we need to do more, is to improve our communication with the general public.
Salafa, you heard those responses. What did you make of them?
All we call for is for the government to be in sync and prove that we in Sudan can flourish under a civilian rule without a dictator. We need to know and trust that the government as a whole is following one robust roadmap that clearly outlines practical steps toward the improvement of the socio-economic situation in Sudan. Thank you.
Salafa, thank you. And we have a question now from Hussein Bushra, a pharmacist. Hussein.
What is the Sudanese government vision in providing higher education with excellent standards?
Great question. According to some UNICEF stats, Sudan has one of the largest number of out-of-school children in the Middle East and North Africa region. 76% of primary-age children go to school nationally. Only 28% of secondary-age children attend school. and cultural pressures mean that more men than women tend to get educated. Voila, you're Minister of Youth and Sports. How do you provide excellent education for young people in Sudan?
So yes, education, we have like so many universities and colleges here in Sudan, but I think we need to reassess the kind of education that those colleges and universities provide, and I think that there is a mismatch between the type of education that students get in university and what is needed in the labor market. And this is one of the reasons that employment as well, it's a big issue here in Sudan. And also we need to challenge the preconceived ideas that you need to become a doctor or an engineer. I'm an engineer myself, so don't get me wrong. But in Sudan, we need more into vocational training. We need social sciences. When it comes to high school education, primary education, we need to think of having, subjects in local languages, because here in Sudan we have more than 300 languages. So we need to think of innovative tools as well to encourage, and also it could be linked to the economic situation as well. Some children drop out of school because they cannot afford even a single meal. That's why I know that the Minister of Education is doing a good job in trying to make sure that they can have like free meals for children.
Plenty of challenges, plenty of solutions there the Minister proposed. She said she was an engineer, speciality in nanoparticle fluids. Very glad we're not discussing that. I wouldn't have many questions on that. Mohammed, I want to turn to you now. Education is a pretty difficult area in which to make rapid progress. Is the government doing enough?
Yeah, I agree. It is very difficult to make progress in any sector of public services in general, including education, also health as well. I think no. Again, we cannot see a real progress in these areas, including education and health. Also, it is definitely an inherited problem. Actually, in the last 10 years or so, from 2000 to 2015, the rate of illiteracy in Sudan increased, and we are yet to see progress in the area of education.
Omar, you lived for years in exile, and that gave you the opportunity to spend time in some of America's finest universities. What's the vision then for enabling Sudan to have an educational system to be truly proud of, to perhaps one day rival America's?
We started by investing in education. For the last about 15 years, the combined budget or portion of the budget for education and health together was not more than about 7% to 10%. They allocated between 70 to 75% of the budget for security, including military purposes. And that is how they managed to turn Sudan into a war zone. So what we tried to do in this government was to allocate more money with the lean budget that we have as it is, and with the challenging resources that we have, to raise education all the way to about 14% to 15%. But budget or throwing money at a broken system is not alone a reason to fix it. I myself consider myself very lucky because I'm the product of public education. I never set foot in a private school, and I don't even know what that is until I left Sudan. In 30 years, I left Sudan during these 30 years, and I left behind 4 universities. I recall building a science lab in a high school. Used to cost a lot of money, and Sudan will, work hard for like 4 years or so to be able to find the resources, and we depend on scholarships and grants and things like that. All of a sudden, in the first 6 years of the Bashir government, there were 30 universities springing across the country. That is not quality education, and that is not the way to look at, education was used as a bribe or so. That is not the way to balance the education in the country and the equal distribution of the opportunities for children to learn
So plenty of structural problems to overcome, Omar. And there we must take a pause. We'll be back with our Sudan panel and audience for more World Questions very soon.
This is the BBC World Service, telling the story of the anti-government protests in Belarus.
We grew up in a country where first your door is stroked with chalk, and then a darker chariot arrives, and no one sees you anymore. I'm Valzhina Mort, a Belarusian poet. I live in the US, but my thoughts are back home, because my country is in turmoil. In part 2 of Belarus Across the Barricades, protesters tell me why, despite a climate of fear, they continue to call on President Lukashenko to step down.
Every time we go out to protest, we are really afraid.
You don't know whether you are going to be surrounded by the police, taken to prison.
You have to be on alert who is around you, who is following you.
Society is changing, and to some extent, I think that as a nation, we are born only now.
Belarus Across the Barricades at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm James Copnell, and you're listening to World Questions, where a panel is debating the big issues in post-revolutionary Sudan. So far, we've talked about the struggle to raise employment and living standards, how to keep faith in the post-revolutionary process and education. Still to come, getting off the US's state sponsors of terrorism blacklist, women's rights, and a vision of Sudan's long-term future. That's World Questions after the news.
BBC News with Danielle Yałowiecka. The European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen says she and the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson have agreed to go the extra mile in search of agreement on a post-Brexit trade deal. After what she called a constructive phone call, their negotiating teams will continue talking. The main sticking points for an agreement are fisheries and the degree of future British adherence to EU standards. The Irish Foreign Minister said a deal, while clearly difficult, was possible. Germany is introducing stringent limitations over Christmas to combat coronavirus. After reaching agreement with all 16 states, Chancellor Angela Merkel announced that schools and non-essential shops will close from Wednesday until at least January the 10th. The Afghan Defence Ministry says more than 60 Taliban fighters have been killed in fighting with security forces in Kandahar province. Elsewhere in the province, at least 7 members of one family, including 4 children, are reported to have been killed in airstrikes. More than 400 children are still missing in northwest Nigeria after an armed attack on their school, and families are waiting desperately for news. Late on Saturday, the military said they'd tracked down and exchanged fire with the kidnappers, but they've given no account of what's become of the missing pupils. About 200 others are accounted for. Azerbaijan's defence ministry has said 4 soldiers were killed when their units were attacked near the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Authorities in Armenia reported that 6 of their servicemen were wounded in what they described as an Azeri military offensive. Pakistani TV reports say at least 17 people have been wounded, some critically, after a grenade explosion in the country's 4th city, Rawalpindi. Police have said only 3 were hurt. Iran has summoned the ambassador of Germany, which holds the European Union presidency, after the EU issued a strong condemnation of the hanging of the journalist Ruhollah Zam. BBC News.
Hello, I'm James Copnell. This is the BBC World Service, and you're listening to World Questions Sudan, a country on the way to democracy, but with huge issues still to tackle. I'm in London. All our panellists and questioners are joining us digitally from Sudan. And our panel, Wala Issam Al-Bushi, the Minister for Youth and Sports, Reem Abbas is a leading journalist and blogger, Mohammed Naji Al-Assam is a revolutionary leader and nominee to the Transition Partners Council, and Omar Ismail is the acting Foreign Minister. So let's take the next question, which comes from Khalid Ali, a civil engineer.
My question is, what is important for Sudanese people after the country was delisted from the terrorism list, and what is the benefit for Sudan in this new situation? Thank you.
So the terrorism list Khalid is talking about is the US's state sponsor of terrorism list. Sudan was on that list from 1993 onwards. President Trump removed that designation back in October. The Sudanese government also under pressure at that time, it seems, to normalise relations with Israel in response. Omar Ismail, acting foreign minister, what do you say to Khalid's question? What Sudan had to do to get off the list and what benefit for Sudan now?
I would say to Khalid that Sudan had done a lot to be removed from the list of state-sponsored terrorism, and very little is left now to complete that move by the government of the United States. And I would say to Khalid that is important because that was his question, what is in it for me? Sudan, as it is, been under sanctions for close to quarter of a century or more, because the behavior of the government of Sudan at the time was not accepted by the international community because of the war in Darfur and the violence that led to the separation of South Sudan. Sudan was deprived from having financial access through banks and other financial houses that were necessary to have foreign direct investment into Sudan. Sudan was not accepted in certain international platforms. So by lifting us from that list, Sudan will become a full-fledged member of the international community. We will talk to the creditors about our debt close to or a little bit exceeding $60 billion. That is a heavy, heavy debt on a country of a budget size like ours and of the challenges that Sudan is now facing. So there are so many things that we gain. Now we are waiting the official announcement from the U.S. Congress, and also we are working hard to be able to get our full sovereign immunity from further prosecution or being taken to court by some of the people, be it the victims of 9/11 or the embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi or many other people that may claim that Sudan, during the designation in that list, might have helped or aided or enabled some of the terrorists around the world to do some damage or attack some people or others. This government has nothing to do with all this. And we, in our engagement with the United States and others to lift Sudan of this ST list, we have not and never will admit that we have done anything wrong that deserves the designation of Sudan on that list.
All right, Reem, you heard the minister there. Has Sudan given up too much? Is Sudan going to benefit a lot?
I think there are two things at play. I mean, definitely the Sudanese people were held hostage, by a terrorist government, and even after they fought back, led to this government's collapse. I think they continued to be punished by the international community, and the terrorist state designation is one of the ways that the Sudanese people were punished. I think definitely delisting Sudan from the black list was necessary. In the process, it's not just about whether Sudan has given a lot to get this, but it's also about the process, how there was very little communication, and a lot of the information that was actually that we were getting about, normalization of relationship with Israel, the information was actually getting published by the other side, by the Israeli journalists, by the Israeli media outlets, as opposed to the...
Well, we seem to be losing Reem's line there. Let me turn briefly, if I could, to Minister Wala. Are you expecting, once it is removed, this designation, that there will be a rapid improvement in people's lives in Sudan, or will it take time?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to stress on the fact that Sudanese people are very peaceful and they didn't deserve to be in this list. I expect there will be an improvement, but it will happen gradually. And I can see some benefit for the young people of Sudan. In the past, even if you would like to apply for a scholarship for the US, we are banned. We are not allowed even for a scholarship. So yes, there will be lots of benefits, but it's going to happen gradually. It will need time to for big companies and banks to come to Sudan, but they will come at the end of the day.
Well, thank you. I want to move on because we've got so many great questions. The next one comes from Maha Musa, a lawyer. Maha.
Thank you to BBC giving this chance to attend this panel about Sudan. My question to speakers contains two parts. First part, as you know, Sudan is a diverse country in its people and resources. How you will manage this diversity to share wealth and public services equally? Second part of my question, now Sudan is sinking into a rough spread of corruption, which affects lower people, especially women. What's your clear plan to fight this corruption?
All right, Maha, thank you. Great question. Couple of parts there. Sharing out Sudan's diversity and resources equally, and how do you fight corruption? Let's go to Mohammed Najel Assam first on this. Vast country, more than 40 million people, resources, yes, but not always shared equally. And that's been a reason for conflict in the past. So what can be done?
Yeah, the issue of diversity management has been there in Sudan since independence in 1956, and definitely it was part of or one of the reasons for conflicts in Sudan throughout our history. We have history with democracy in Sudan. We have tried to establish democracy 3 times in our history since independence, in more than 60 years, with the longest period of democracy only lasting 4 years. And I think we should focus more in this period of time of our transition in asking these questions regarding how can we establish a sustainable democracy in Sudan. I think this is the most important question of transition, and I think the revolution is all about that. How can we take the military out of the equation of ruling Sudan? And until now, unfortunately, we haven't started this discussion in a large scale yet. Yes, the urgent issues are very important, and we must discuss them and find answers to the questions of economy and education and health. But if we could not manage to agree or to reach a consensus about the issue of establishing democracy, I think the revolution will not be successful, and we will not get out of this evil circle, if I may say, having a very short democracy or transitional periods of democracy and then getting back again into military dictatorships.
Let me turn to Omar Ismail. You spent many years in exile, complaining in part about Sudan's failure to deal with diversity and fairness for all parts of society. Now you're part of government. Is it a lot harder from within a ministerial chair than from looking on the outside?
It was definitely, it is harder. Now I'm in the thick of it. And I see that the damage that is being done by not respecting that diversity and by dividing Sudan to be easy to rule, and by the wars, whether in Darfur or the Blue Nile or in South Kordofan, or even the war that is in the heart of Khartoum, when people were identified by their ethnicity and brutally killed or maltreated. I look at it, and I look at where I used to live in the United States most of this time that I was in exile. And I look at other countries as well. I worked in Somalia. They speak the same language, they practice the same faith, and only 4 tribes. However, Somalia was far from being stable. The lack of diversity there may be. You see the same effect as it was in places like Sudan, with the abundance of the diversity and the lack of respecting that or managing it in a way that will bring the strength of these diverse peoples, rather than using that diversity to suppress them and to keep them apart.
It's all about using diversity as a strength rather than a tool for division. I want to move on to the second part of Maha's question, which is about a plan for fighting corruption, particularly as corruption, Maha says, affects poorer people more and it affects women more. Reem.
Yes, I mean, I think 30 years of the Islamist rule, I mean, and they were very corrupt, you know, from the president to all his different cronies, it has made corruption systematic. And I think part of the state bureaucracy enhances and supports and corruption. So it is now endemic in all segments of the society, and we're seeing them in all just aspects of life. For example, fuel, a lot of fuel, especially in the border states, is smuggled to neighboring countries, and even in Khartoum, you go to the petrol station and you see people buying fuel and then they sell it in the black market. So this has become a way of life. The communities have become used to this as a way to basically make a livelihood. You have the police is part of the problem. There's corruption at all the different levels, and the corruption networks are within the government, they are outside the government, they're within the armed forces, the police. So it is so deep. And sadly, it's a lot of people who have positions of power.
All right. Minister Wella, how do you respond to that? People in positions of power, including in the government, responsible for corruption. And as Maha says, what is your plan for fighting it?
For me personally, I'm going to talk about a personal experience at my ministry. Like when I was appointed as a minister, I found in my desk one of the longest, corruption cases in the history of Sudan. Sudan Sport City is a project that started in the 90s. The location was allocated for the project was 1,450,000 square meters. The previous regime they have stolen 1,080,000+ square meters. They just left 450,000 square meters for us, to finish the project. So what I did, I took all the evidence on the file and I had a meeting with the Attorney General and I filed a lawsuit. Investigation is finally completed and charges were filed against 8 people. On top of them is the Vice President himself.
Pretty senior figures involved. That's one approach. Let's move on to the next question. Amna Omer, a 25-year-old geologist from El Obeid in Sudan.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor for me to participate in this great program. Thank you for giving us this chance as Sudanese. My question is, how do you think that the mindset of many women in Sudan can be changed? Because many women feel they do not deserve equal rights and a better life. Thank you.
If you go through the statistics, there's some pretty scary ones about life as a young woman in Sudan. 1 in 3 women married before 18, 9 out of 10 have undergone female genital mutilation. That's according to the United Nations. Thousands of women sentenced to floggings over the years under the public order laws, with poor and minority women particularly affected. And yet also, if you go into offices in Khartoum, you find women in prominent positions too. Reem, let me start with you. What's interesting here is the question of mindset, not laws or legal framework. How can women's mindsets be changed to feel they deserve equal rights?
Yes, I love the way she worded the question, and I think this is really what we're seeing right now, because there is a backlash right now. We are seeing more insecurity for women on the streets. The streets are becoming more unsafe for women. We are seeing a backlash against women because they were very much taking part in the revolution, and they had very loud voices. And I think this mindset cannot be changed if we don't look at the context. I think many felt that the removal of the Islamists would, by default, change the situation for women, as discriminatory laws will be abolished. The government would try to lessen the suffering of women, but the situation has not changed, dramatically. The political parties in the Freedom and Change Coalition, for example, very patriarchal, and they actually conspire to push women out of potential decision-making positions. For example, Sudan repealed Article 152 on indecent dressing, but did this impact all women? No, the public order and the morality police that continue to prosecute women based on behavior and dress code, they're still there as an institution, and they're still picking and harassing and arresting vulnerable women. So So all of this sustained impunity and this lack of justice for women victims, especially if we're talking about victims of sexual violence, especially in conflict areas, because right now they're seeing that the people that ordered their sexual violence and the people that violated them are actually in power right now, and they have a lot of power. So it's a situation where the whole system is against you. We're fighting so many different fronts at the same time. So it's very, very frustrating, but we have to continue fighting.
Ismail, more than a year since this transitional government was set up, it's not doing enough to change the situation of women. Do you agree?
I do agree. It's not doing enough. And I think the civil society institutions as well, they need to do more to bring back the dignity to the females in Sudan. The courts, we need to change the laws. We need to reform.
But you're at the heart of the government. You say more needs to be done. You're acting foreign minister.
I'm acting foreign minister. I said we need to do more. We haven't done nearly enough to alleviate the suffering of women in terms of the way that they were considered second-class citizens. We need equality in the workplace. We need to work harder in the government to do this, to hire more women in higher positions. But I think if I understood the question correctly, the women themselves don't think they deserve to be like this. Maybe because of the long oppression made some of them have that low self-esteem. What we need to do is another way of educating our brothers and sisters at home, because all these things start at home. We are in a society that is well known for its biases towards the males. So it all starts at home, and then the education system, we need to introduce in our curricula certain elements that will make the girls feel more respected and come out.
Minister Wala, the question here really, Amna's question, is about mindset. How do women change their mindset to feel they deserve equal rights? Your response?
Okay, so I think mindset is key here, because when you have the right mindset, you have the right soldiers to defend other women's rights. What saddens me the most that we used to have one of the oldest and strongest women movement in the history of the African continent and the Middle East. We pioneered like many positions, like the first female judge in Africa, just as one example. So to change the mindset, I always say that we need to start from early, childhood stage. We need to work with both young girls and young boys at early age. So when we talk about the mindset, we need to change the mindset of both female and males. And also women need to see more role models for two reasons. When you have a role model in front of you, you will be inspired and motivated. And when you have women in leadership position, they will fight for other women, from within the system. When it comes to the forces of freedom and change, we cannot see women representation. Like, for instance, the steering committee of FFC, they have only one woman in that steering committee.
Well, Wella, let me pick up on that. You're saying there's not enough political representation in the Forces of Freedom and Change, the FFC. Mohammed is a key...
In the government.
And in the government that you represent. Mohammed, you're part of the Forces of Freedom and Change. Why are there not more women involved in senior roles? And don't men's mindsets need to change? Briefly, if you could.
Thank you. And I would like also to disagree with Her Excellency Wala and also with Reem regarding that the FFC has somehow, Reem used the word conspire to sideline women. I don't believe this is true at all. During the transitional period, this transitional authority that was backed by the FFC itself has remarkably increased the issue of women representation. For instance, we are having now the first women chief justice in the history of Sudan, and we have many ministers, we have women in the Sovereign Council. So I think it's clear that we have huge difference for the situation of women in the urban areas and in the rural areas. It's partly an issue of social and cultural problem, and it's always a process. It's a process. Change itself is a process. We need to have that mindset that to improve our situation in general, to establish our democracy, to improve the situation of women, it's a process. It will take time. It's a reform. We need to remove all of these thoughts that women should not be there, as the question by Amna, that women cannot have role in ruling or in political participation.
And Mohammed, you say it's a process, and I think in a way, in a broader sense, that takes us on to our last question from Ali Osman. Ali, give us your question, please.
Okay, my question is, what is the future of Sudan? And what is our future vision? And how can we engage the Sudanese youth to solve Sudan's problems?
Ali, thank you. A question about vision and a question particularly involving youth. So I'll turn directly to Wala Issam Al-Bushi, Minister for Youth and Sport.
So thank you, Ali, for your questions. I always meet lots of young people of Sudan. I always tell them that they need to think about active citizenship, even for them, because they played a major role in toppling, the previous dictatorship. Now is their time to put hand in hand with the government as well to build, Sudan. Now we have a project that is ongoing, is to have a youth parliament. We are now in the stage of having a big youth conference, and before that we are going to have like smaller conferences in the different states. We are planning to do this to make sure that the youth are part of everything that we are doing in the ministry. From the other part of future of Sudan, for me now, the main goal is to build a strong institution, to have the constitution conference, and then to have election.
Mohammed Najil Assam, let me turn to you. Big picture here. Sudan, where would you like it to be in 10 years, 20 years?
Yeah, I agree with Her Excellency Owala that the goal here is to establish strong institutions. The signing of Juba Peace Agreement, the government and the rebel armed movements reached an agreement that Sudan will be a federation, and this needs a lot of very strong civil society in the different regions of Sudan. And we need this civil society to watch over the transition and to watch over the next democracy will.
Omar Ismail, the future of Sudan.
The future of Sudan looks bright to me because the young people that managed to topple this dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir and to flood the streets chanting slogans of freedom and peace and justice. I think they are the future of the country. They need, like Dr. Assam said, to organize themselves. They need to take over the country by a storm and build the institutions that take them there. I see that so many people are angry at the political parties and they don't want to even think or hear the word Ummah or Ittihadi or the political parties in Sudan.
The historical parties.
The historical parties. Build your own, because there is no democracy without political parties. Go out there and to choose your representatives and to choose the people that will lead this country into the 21st century and beyond. This is your role. Our role is to, within these 3 years, we will have to work hard to keep these institutions functioning and building them, like Minister Wala was saying, strengthening them. We need to rebuild our connection and talking to each other. That is the way we can ride the vehicle into the future with bright eyes and looking at the prize of building this country, not just for us today or tomorrow, but for a millennia to come and beyond.
Ali, you're listening to that. You're 25, unemployed, looking for a job. You've heard there from some of the country's leaders saying, you did a revolution. How do you see your future and Sudan's future?
Okay, I believe that the future of Sudan will be better. The current government has dealt with many problems that hinder development in Sudan, some of which are achieving peace in Sudan. Young people must be included in the current government today. Really, yes, we are facing economic problems and more problems in Sudan today, but tomorrow will be better because youth today, they are the leader of the future.
Ali Osman, thank you very much indeed. And that is all we have time for this edition of World Questions. Next month, we'll have a panel from all over the European Union, and we'll be taking questions on the future of the EU from across the continent. On behalf of producers Charlie Taylor and Helen Towner and the BBC World Service, thank you to our brilliant panel, all our wonderful questioners, and to all of you listening wherever you are around the world. I'm James Copnell. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, where Dr. Mark Carney delivers this year's Wreath Lectures.
Has the COVID-19 pandemic shifted our values?
Fundamental questions of the value of life versus the economy.
Dr. Mark Carney discusses how it has forced us to confront how we prioritise health, wealth and opportunity, and whether the importance of these values is changing.
The Wreath Lectures, Wednesday at 10 GMT. And in 60 minutes, The Big Idea with David Edmonds.
Examining questions, all linked to life in the city. What's the appeal of cities? How can we stop rogue cops? What's the link between culture and whether people follow the rules? And how do we stop the next pandemic?
NewsHour is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm James Menendez. Coming up, the talking continues. Britain and the European Union agreed to extend their negotiations on a post-Brexit trade deal. We'll hear from London and from Brussels.
We both think that it is responsible at this point in time to go the extra mile and to see whether an agreement can be reached even at this late stage.
Also today, hundreds of children in northern Nigeria are still reported missing after an armed raid on their secondary school. We'll talk to the Nigerian president's spokesman. And as the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine is rolled out, we'll put one man's safety concerns to a doctor who tells us it's funding that's driven the pace of development.
In this case, there was no problem getting funding. The funding was effectively almost thrown at the companies to develop these new vaccines by governments across the world.
All of that and more after the news.
Hello, this is Danielle Yawowiecka with the BBC News. Britain and the European Union have agreed to extend talks on a post-Brexit trade deal, with an end-of-year deadline looming before Britain leaves the EU's single market and customs union. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said she and Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson had agreed in a phone call to go the extra mile. Our political correspondent, Nick Erdley, is following developments.
The fact these talks are continuing matters because it suggests that both sides still think that this is all to play for, that it's possible that those unresolved issues can somehow be resolved. What we don't know definitively yet is whether anything substantive has happened, whether either side is given that nod or a wink to the other to say, maybe we can compromise a bit on that if you move closer to us on that thing to get this over the line. But those talks are going to continue pretty much immediately. And for the first time, it seems that both sides think there is at least some ground for a bit of optimism.
Chancellor Merkel has announced tighter coronavirus restrictions that will apply across Germany over the holiday period after reaching agreement with all 16 states. Jenny Hill reports from Berlin.
Angela Merkel has for months urged Germany's regional leaders to impose harsher restrictions. And this morning, as the number of infections and deaths continues to rise, they finally agreed. Non-essential shops, schools and hairdressers will shut on Wednesday. Pubs, restaurants, arts and leisure facilities were closed last month as part of a so-called lockdown light, which Mrs Merkel said hadn't done enough to bring the second wave under control. Germany is all but cancelling Christmas. Festivities will be restricted to small family gatherings, and with a ban on alcohol consumption outdoors, even the traditional mulled wine stalls will have to close.
The Afghan Defence Ministry says more than 60 Taliban fighters have been killed in fierce fighting with security forces in the southern province of Kandahar. The two sides are involved in peace negotiations. Here's Ambar Hassan Etirajan.
The Afghan security forces have launched a heavy air and ground assault to repel Taliban advances in at least 5 districts surrounding the city of Kandahar. Local residents said the fighting continued several hours through the night. The Defense Ministry says Taliban has suffered heavy losses, but there are no details of government casualties. Elsewhere in Kandahar, in the district of Argandab, residents said at least 7 members of a family, including 4 children, were killed in airstrikes. On Saturday, several rockets hit the capital Kabul, killing 1 person and disrupting operations at the international airport for a few hours.
More than 36 hours after an armed attack on a secondary school in northwestern Nigeria, desperate families are waiting for news of what's become of the more than 400 children still missing. A government statement is expected in the coming hours. You're listening to the World News from the BBC. Protests are continuing in Belarus, demanding the resignation of the country's long-standing authoritarian leader Alexander Lukashenko. Small groups have gathered in different parts of the capital, Minsk, a contrast to the large-scale marches seen in the first months of protests. The regular Sunday demonstrations started in August after a presidential election that has been widely denounced as rigged. Police in the Pakistani city of Rawalpindi say at least 3 people have been injured in a blast near a police station. They said initial reports suggested a hand grenade hidden in a wheelbarrow exploded. Television channels report considerably more. At least 17 are injured, with some said to be in a critical condition. The blast came as a coalition of opposition parties are due to hold an anti-government rally in Lahore. Malaysia's maritime agency says it has intercepted the country's largest ever haul of crystal meth, seizing tens of millions of dollars worth of the drug from a speedboat. More from Celia Hatton.
Malaysia's Coast Guard officers say they spotted a boat off northern Penang state that was making some erratic movements. After a 30-minute chase, the driver of the boat jumped overboard and was then arrested. On board, officers discovered more than $26 million worth of crystal meth hidden inside packets of Chinese tea they believe came from Myanmar. It's the largest ever seizure by Malaysia's maritime agency, but drug enforcement experts believe the region's powerful drug syndicates, which operate between China, Southeast Asia and Australia, will quickly fill the gap left by the seizure.
Police in southern India have arrested more than 100 workers who went on a rampage over allegations of unpaid wages at a Taiwanese-run iPhone factory near Bangalore. Videos on social media showed broken glass panels and CCTV cameras and flipped cars at Wistron Infocom's manufacturing facility. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. I'm James Menendez. And our top story is those post-Brexit trade talks between the British government and the European Union. Both sides had agreed to set today as a final deadline to decide whether an agreement was within sight or whether to call it a day. But about an hour ago, following a phone call between the European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen and the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, she gave a statement saying that the talks would, after all, continue.
I had a constructive and useful phone call with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. We discussed the major unsolved topics. Our negotiation teams have been working day and night over the recent days, and despite the exhaustion after almost 1 year of negotiations, and despite the fact that deadlines have been missed over and over, we both think that it is responsible at this point in time to go the extra mile. We have accordingly mandated our negotiators to continue the talks and to see whether an agreement can be reached, even at this late stage. The negotiations continue here in Brussels.
And this is what Mr. Johnson had to say just a few minutes ago.
As things stand, and this was basically what Ursula and I agreed, I'm afraid we're still very far apart on some key things, but where there's life, there's hope. We're going to keep talking to see what we can do. The UK certainly won't be walking away from the talks. I think people would expect us to go the extra mile. I repeated my offer, which is, if it's necessary to talk to other capitals, and I'm very happy to do that. The Commission very determined to keep the negotiations on the way that they've been done between us and the Commission. That's that's fine.
The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Well, let's go live to Brussels and the BBC's Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly. Kevin, the fact that these talks are going to continue, is that a sign that some progress is being made?
I think it must be. Maybe not an enormous amount of progress, and it may be that the key dynamic here is more a mutual lack of desire to see the whole process collapse. So we shouldn't certainly conclude that some enormous breakthrough has been made, but there's certainly a huge desire, both in London and in Brussels, to avoid a breakdown. Now, Ursula von der Leyen said that there had been a constructive conversation with Boris Johnson. That did imply at least that some grounds for progress have been identified. Boris Johnson did not sound quite so positive. But I suppose the very simple conclusion one has to draw is they have at least decided that there is enough possibility of movement to make it worthwhile to continue the negotiations. So I don't think we should conclude from this that a deal can now be taken for granted, very far from it, but there must be some prospect of it, or they might have decided to pull the plug today.
And that phrase from Ursula von der Leyen, major unsolved topics, how far apart are the two sides at this very late stage?
That's a very interesting question. We have said over and over again, what are the areas of disagreement? Yes, it's about fisheries, it's about some future mechanism for policing a trade agreement, and above all, it's about the level playing field, which is what sort of concessions you have to give the European Union in return for access to the European Union single market. But on the granular detail of how those issues are separated in the two sides, we really can't be sure. What exactly are the disputes over fisheries? What proportion of the European catch is the European side trying to maintain? What degree of divergence from future European rules might the UK want? They are the crucial issues which the negotiators are talking about. They're the technical issues which are being drilled into day after day, week after week in the talks, but not much at that level of detail is leaking into the public domain, and that makes it really hard to judge, first of all, how likely a breakthrough is, but secondly, where a breakthrough might come. So I feel all along it's been a slightly strange situation where at one level we know an awful lot about the topic, but at another and perhaps more important level, we really don't know very much.
Kevin, thank you very much indeed. BBC's Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly joining us live from Brussels, while also on the line our UK political correspondent Rob Watson. Rob, Mr. Johnson, Boris Johnson sounding a little more downbeat, saying that no deal was still the most likely outcome.
What I think I should do first, James, is heartily endorse everything my colleague Kevin said. So to pick up from that, because I think he's got it absolutely spot on. Yes, I think Mr. Johnson's tone was somewhat more negative than the European Commission president, but he did say there is a deal to be done, and at the risk of driving everyone listening utterly insane, James, including you, I mean, I just sort of stick to what I've always said, really, that until there's definitively a deal, definitively no deal, or definitively a talk to continue, then all three outcomes are possible. In this case, it's the third one, isn't it? They're going to carry on talking.
Yeah, and we keep telling people, this is the final deadline, this is last-ditch talks, this is crunch time. But, I mean, there is an actual hard deadline, which is the end of the year, isn't there?
Yes, and to be fair to us in the media, it's not us doing the lines in the sand and down to the wire. That's been the politicians and the diplomats, and one feels with the lines in the sand, we're kind of out of the desert. We've been through so many. But you're absolutely right. I mean, technically speaking, the real deadline is the 1st of January. Why? Because that's when the UK's transition out of membership of the European Union comes to an end. And then if there's absolutely nothing in place, James, the UK just becomes a third country. So it would have the same sort of relationship with the EU as, I don't know, Afghanistan or something.
How much pressure is Mr. Johnson under not to give ground in these negotiations?
So here's the sort of the dynamic that Mr. Johnson faces. So the pressure not to give ground comes from, I think, the bulk of the Conservative Party. So the majority of Conservative MPs who, he knows that if he does too much of a compromise, there'll be the chance of betrayal and that the Conservatives will get rid of him, just like they got rid of Theresa May. Pressure the other way comes from some senior figures in the Conservative Party, so-called grandees, people who've been in the cabinet before and who just think that a no deal would be disastrous, that it would leave the UK as a sort of international pressure. The other pressure against the pressure in favour of doing a deal is really a fear that Mr. Johnson would have that history and posterity might not look very kindly on a Prime Minister who had heaped the pain of a no-deal Brexit on top of the pain of the pandemic of COVID.
Yes, and on that point, just briefly, I mean, is it worth pointing that out that whatever happens in these negotiations, the relationship that Britain has with the European Union is going to be very different on January the 1st, and there will be an economic impact?
Absolutely. I mean, even a deal would be the hardest of hard Brexits. Even with a deal, there are going to be customs checks. There are going to be checks on regulations. At the moment, there are none at all. It's been forecast that there could be 400 million extra customs checks a year. Imagine the paperwork, James.
Yes, I'm glad I don't have to fill out those forms. Rob, thank you very much indeed. That was our UK political correspondent, Rob Watson. Now, there have been weeks of street protests in Poland over a ruling by the Constitutional Court, which has all but outlawed abortion. The ruling hasn't come into force yet, but critics say it will drive even more Polish women to seek abortions abroad. Those countries include neighbours such as the Czech Republic, from where our correspondent Rob Cameron sent us this report.
Poland's strict new abortion law has forced thousands onto the streets ever since the country's constitutional court outlawed terminations even in cases of fetal defects. Poland's government, caught off guard by the scale of the protests, has pulled back from the final step of publishing the law, which would ban all abortion except in cases of rape, incest, and where the mother's life or health were in danger. But even before the present conflict, Polish women were already being forced to go abroad to terminate their pregnancies.
I freaked out. I had no idea what to do.
Anna, not her real name, got pregnant by accident while still at university several years ago. Her words are read by an actor.
So I was 22 years old. I was studying at the time, and it was an accident. I found out pretty soon, and it was a shock. I had no clue what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure, that I could not tell anyone who could probably help me.
And I believe that you ordered pills over the internet, abortion pills, and they never came. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
I was supposed to receive the pills within a week. After a week, nothing happened. I think it was like 9 days that I waited. And then I got the letter from customs that there was a package for me and they don't know what's inside, and they would like me to come for interrogation, and they would like to find out what is it and why do I order it.
So how did you feel when you got that letter from the customs?
Of course, I was super scared. My friends all advised me not to go, which is what I did. I never showed up, never called, nothing.
Instead, Anna came to Prague. After being turned down by 3 gynecologists because she wasn't a permanent resident here, she obtained a fake job contract, meaning she was in theory insured even for non-urgent care in the Czech Republic, and a hospital finally performed the procedure. In fact, the Health Ministry confirmed to the BBC that by rights, Czech hospitals and private clinics cannot refuse early-term abortions to Polish citizens, but finding Czech clinics who interpret EU law in this way isn't always easy. Marta Makowowska is from a new Prague-based NGO called Ciocia Ciecia. which not only provides Polish women with information, but also raises funds and even finds helpers to accompany them once they arrive in this country.
We realized when we started actually hearing about what's happening in Poland that even getting an abortion that will be a result of an illegal action, of some sort of crime like rape or incest, is really difficult because you have to go through the whole legal procedure. And some women just give up, because they are being victims, they are being treated as criminals.
There are no figures on exactly how many Polish women make the journey to the Czech Republic each year. It could be hundreds or thousands. Anna, who's since settled in Prague, has never told her family about her abortion. She says she'll never return to live in Poland.
And that was the BBC's Rob Cameron reporting there from the Czech Republic. Coming up in the second half of the programme, the search in Denmark for a transgender actor to play a transgender role, and why the project has become such a talking point.
Representation is important because people who have been portrayed on stages or in movies or in theatres or so on or in stores, they haven't had the control of their own narrative. And that's really something that we have to change, is the fact that people are not only seen in the characters that they were portrayed on stage, but they also have an influence on it.
More on that coming up in about 20 minutes' time. Let's just recap our main headlines from the newsroom this hour. Britain and the European Union have agreed to continue talks on their post-Brexit trade relations, with both sides agreeing to go the extra mile to secure a deal. And the Afghan military says it's killed dozens of Taliban fighters in Kandahar province as violence surges, despite progress in the peace process. This is James Menendez with NewsHour live from the BBC. We're going to turn to the pandemic now in two countries where case numbers are rising fast. First, to Germany, where Chancellor Angela Merkel today announced tighter restrictions for the coming holiday period. Non-essential shops and schools will close from Wednesday until at least the 10th of January. And there'll be strict limits on the number of guests for Christmas. Pubs, restaurants and arts and leisure venues were closed last month, but Mrs. Merkel said these previous measures hadn't worked.
Nachdem wir eine Zeit lang das exponentielle Wachstum stoppen konnten.
After we were able for a while to stop the exponential growth and see a plateauing, in the past few days we've again had an increase in the number of cases and exponential growth. And that means that we are mourning a lot of deaths. You can all see the statistics. We know the health system is already very heavily burdened, and our task, our aim, was always to avoid overloading the health system. So there's an urgent need for action, and that's what's behind today's decision.
Well, live to talk to our Berlin correspondent, Jenny Hill, who's on the line. Jenny, I mean, is Christmas cancelled in Germany then?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, the restrictions mean that people will still be able to celebrate. There's a very small relaxation between the 24th and 26th of December to allow people to get together, a maximum of 9 people. But that's a small gathering from, it's got to be people within your family. And Mrs. Merkel urged people to spend the 7 days beforehand avoiding all contacts too. But a lot of your average German traditions won't be happening this year. Church services will take place, but under very, very restricted conditions. There's certainly not much in the way of singing, and that rather charming German custom of going out and getting a takeaway Glühwein from a stall and drinking it under the stars, that's going too, because as of Wednesday there'll be a ban on the consumption of alcohol outdoors.
How have things got to where they are, got so bad, given how relatively Germany did so well in the first wave earlier in the year?
Big question, lots of answers to it, but in my view, one of them is political. Angela Merkel has for months been trying to urge Germany's regional leaders who have responsibility for imposing restrictions to take a tougher stance. She's been warning for months that if they didn't, this would happen. She's been very frustrated, very angry. You'll have seen her speaking in a very impassioned way in the last week or two. Finally, I think those regional leaders have stopped playing politics. They've looked at the numbers. We've had record case numbers, record death numbers here in the last couple of weeks. And I think they're starting to panic. So actually, even before today's meeting, some state prime ministers were already imposing restrictions of their own, including in some places a nighttime curfew and more stringent lockdowns. So it didn't take them very long to decide with Angela Merkel today this particular set of measures, whereas in the past, these talks have gone on for hours and hours and hours as she's tried to persuade them to come up with a proper countrywide strategy. So there are people who'll be blaming those regional leaders, and a lot of scientists among them who've been warning again for weeks, if not months, that a harder stance needed to be taken.
And is public opinion largely on the side of these tighter restrictions? Do people accept the need for them?
Yeah, I think it is. It's always difficult, isn't it, to quote surveys, but surveys do suggest that the overwhelming majority of Germans were in favour of harder restrictions, actually, and people have been very spooked by these numbers. And actually, newspapers publish sort of maps of hospitals around the country, and you can see, actually, some of them have no space left in their intensive care units. Others are filling up very, very fast indeed, so people are worried. At the same time, of course, over the weekend, police are saying they're having to break up parties which are happening illegally. So there are a lot of people still flouting the rules. But by and large, the majority of Germans, I think, whilst they're not happy about what's going to happen over Christmas and New Year, they're going to have to give up their celebrations. I think they understand that they're necessary.
Jenny, thank you very much indeed. Jenny Hill, our Berlin correspondent. Well, let's turn to South Korea now. The number of cases there is also surging. On Sunday, the authorities reported more than 1,000 new confirmed cases for the second day in a row. But important to say that overall infection numbers per capita are far lower than in most European countries and the US. The total number of cases is about 42,000, with 580 deaths out of a population of just over 50 million. Nevertheless, the government is worried and it's considering much tighter restrictions, including closing schools. The President Moon Jae-in described the situation as an emergency. Hyun-mi Park is a British national working at the Korea University College of Medicine in Seoul as a surgeon and research professor. How serious then is this third wave?
So it's all relative. Today is the first time that we have reached over 1,000 positive cases per day. Even during our first wave, which was back in February, we were under 1,000 a day. And now we have been steadily increasing since October. And we have been getting in the hundreds and 600. And problem is that the social distancing rules that Korea has was decreased during the middle of October because the numbers were in double figures only. So we thought the wave has been okay for the third wave, that we think that it was the third wave, which was in August. And the social distancing came down to 2.5, down to 2, which means that people could gather for about 100 people. Everybody was still wearing masks. Children were allowed to go to school at a 2/3 capacity. Unfortunately, Halloween happened because the numbers spiked after that and they haven't gone down. And the problem this time round compared to the previous ones is that we haven't got any actually major clusters. It's just that it's everywhere. Everywhere is having between 20 and 30 cases, and it's mainly concentrated in the Seoul metropolitan area, which is the 6th largest population density city in the world. And that's the problem that before it was in other areas, in other cities.
But as you say, it is all relative, because compared to other countries of a similar size, the numbers are far lower. I think, over 578 deaths? Well, so nearly 600 deaths since the pandemic began, which is far less than, for example, other European countries of a similar size, isn't it?
True. So when I was looking into the numbers today, when the news came out, and we're looking into going up to the social distancing level 3, which is the maximum, and that pretty much similar to the European lockdown by closing all the stores, which hasn't happened until now. And that's because we have reached 1,000. And I thought, okay, I'll have a look at what's happening back home in the UK. And we're still in the UK at over 20,000 positive cases a day. And in Korea, we have never gone over 10 deaths per day, all throughout since February when it all started. And we are in single figures death numbers, and we're still on patients who are quite elderly and also with comorbidities. So it's all relative, but I think the main issue with the government is that they don't want the economy to suffer.
Are people supportive of much, much tighter restrictions, even though, as you say, the numbers are comparatively low?
Yes, actually the people are like, let's go into lockdown and get this over and done with, because we are tired. We've been doing this for 10 months and we want to get completely completely rid of it. There is a lot of accusations of people who break the rules, and there is a social responsibility level which is very different to European mentality.
Because what, people generally adhere to the regulations more tightly?
Yes. It has been, it's quite a different cultural point of view that I have noticed since being here, is that it's a lot more community-based instead of individual-based.
One other thing, South Korea was held up as an example of a country that dealt with the initial wave very well, and particularly because of its test and trace system. I mean, is that still functioning as it should, or has it become more difficult, as you say, because there haven't been these individual clusters?
Yes, it's still happening, or there is test and track and trace is still ongoing. But as I said before, it's a lot harder when it is much smaller groups instead of one big cult church or one big event like it was in May. It was around the Itaewon clubbing area, and they just controlled all of those people all at once. But this time round, it's just all very much spread across the 26 million population in the Seoul metropolitan area.
Dr. Hyun Mi Park speaking to me from Seoul.
This is the BBC World Service. Now here's something to think about.
When someone has a brilliant idea, it's a light bulb moment. But then they have to prove their theory.
Educated places do much better than less educated places. That is true within Brazil, that is true within China, that is true within India, and that's certainly true within the United Kingdom.
I'm David Edmonds, and in The Big Idea, I'll be examining new research all linked to life in the city.
Generally speaking, movements have not failed after achieving 3.5% of the population's participation.
There's no question that a pandemic is a body blow to urban spaces.
They were asking, what do Japanese police officers need more of? And we were all guessing, do they need higher pay or more vacation time? And it turns out they need more crime.
I found some of the most fascinating ideas around and the people who thought them up.
The Big Idea, in half an hour.
Coming up on NewsHour in the next 30 minutes, we'll talk to Nigeria's presidential spokesman about the missing school children in northern Katsina state. Were they kidnapped for money? Also, we'll hear about efforts to protect one of Colombia's unique species of monkey. And we'll be putting one man's concerns about the safety of the new COVID vaccine to a doctor. All that's coming up after the news.
BBC News with David Harper. Britain and the European Union have said they'll go the extra mile to secure a post-Brexit trade deal and will extend their talks as an end-of-year deadline approaches. The European Commission chief, Ursula von der Leyen, said her latest call with the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was constructive. Their decision to go on talking has been welcomed by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and by Ireland, whose Foreign Minister Simon Coveney said an agreement, though difficult, was still possible. The main points of contention are fisheries and the so-called level playing field. Germany is introducing stringent limitations over Christmas to combat coronavirus. Mrs. Merkel announced that schools and non-essential shops would close from Wednesday until at least January the 10th. The Afghan Defence Ministry says more than 60 Taliban fighters have died in fighting with security forces in Kandahar province. Elsewhere in the province, at least 7 members of one family, including 4 children, are reported to have been killed in airstrikes. Families in northwest Nigeria are waiting desperately for news as the whereabouts of more than 400 children abducted from their school remain uncertain. On Saturday, the military said they tracked down and exchanged fire with the kidnappers. About 200 other pupils are accounted for. Azerbaijan says 4 of its soldiers were killed when their units were attacked near the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Authorities in Armenia reported that 6 of their servicemen were wounded in what they described as an Azeri military offensive. Clusters of people have gathered across Minsk, the capital of Belarus, continuing the Sunday demonstrations against the authoritarian president Alexander Lukashenko. Protests have been calling on him to quit since August, after a presidential election widely denounced as rigged. Police in southern India have arrested more than 100 workers who went on a rampage over allegations of unpaid wages at a Taiwanese-run factory near Bangalore. They say they've had no pay in 4 months. BBC News.
Coming up next on NewsHour, hundreds of children have been abducted, it's been reported, from a school in northern Nigeria. We'll be talking to the president's spokesman. That's in just a few minutes. But first we're going to head to Colombia, which is home to 10 primate species found nowhere else on Earth. One of them is the white-footed tamarin. The tamarin's a small and charismatic monkey, but because of deforestation, logging, farming and mining, as well as trafficking in animals, it's also endangered. Victoria Stunt in Colombia reports on how people are trying to protect them.
I'm with biologist Ivan Soto Calderon, looking for the white-footed tamarin. But we're not in the rainforest. We're in a small patch of trees in the concrete jungle of Medellin.
They're territorialists, so when they hear this sound, they come to see.
The tamarins are some of the original inhabitants here.
The urban areas have several problems. In terms of connectivity, the forests tend to be isolated, and they actually become patches, which leads to isolation of different small populations. And the small groups, small populations, are more likely to extinguish.
Ivan says making sure the city tamarins are healthy is important.
The whole world tends to be urbanized, so we cannot anymore focus in conservation efforts in rural and pristine areas.
Este es uno de los sitios donde los vemos muy frecuentemente.
Joanna Maria Ramirez lives in the housing community next door and works to conserve the primate habitat. I asked her how the human and tamarin neighbors get along.
When I first started working with environmental education, we used to see kids bothering the birds and the tamarins with rocks. There's incredible respect for the tamarins now.
Another challenge is the thriving illegal pet trade. Rescued animals are sent to a rehabilitation center, and genetic tests are used to find out which wild population they came from, so they can be grouped together and released. Researchers open a crate containing 5 small silvery gray tamarins. Some quickly jump out, others peer curiously out at the forest, 150 kilometers northeast of Medellin. Biologist Vanessa Bustamante says tamarins have to unlearn being pets.
Muchas personas les dan tetero, los visten.
A lot of people give them bottles, they dress them up, they make them act in a very human way, which isn't right.
Once all out of the crate, the tamarins took a good look around, climbed into the trees, and jumped from branch to branch. After about 10 minutes, they were gone.
El primer momento fue increíble porque salieron como tenían que ser.
The first moment was incredible because they left as they should have, running away from us, escaping into the forest.
That was biologist Vanessa Bustamante, ending that report by Victoria Stunt in Colombia. You're listening to News Hour live from the BBC in London. I'm James Menendez. To Katsina State in northern Nigeria now, where hundreds of desperate families are waiting for news after their children went missing during an armed raid on their school. The gunmen stormed the government science secondary school at Kankara late on Friday night, kidnapping an unknown number of the students. The security forces say they know where the attackers are, but the fate of the missing children is still murky. Some of them have already made their own way home, but Binta Ismail is still trying to find out what happened to her son and to her brother.
Honestly speaking, we're in a terrifying condition here. We don't see the value of the government, in fact. I have a younger brother and a child taken by the kidnappers. I'm from the Dandia, Katsina State, and have been in this school since dawn, and there is still no update.
Well, Katsina State is President Muhammadu Buhari's home state, and he happens to be there at the moment. I've been talking to his spokesman, Garba Shehu. First, how many children are still missing?
Some of the boys who had now come back from the bush, from the forest, are saying that they believed that there are 10 of their colleagues who had been taken by the bandits. This needs to be verified.
Right, so it may not be hundreds at all, many fewer than that.
They fled in so many directions arising from the confusion that followed the shootings. Some may have traveled home because students in that college come from all over the state. Parents, out of panic, had also come picked their own. So all of the effort now is to know who is at home, who is keeping home.
In terms of those that are still missing, what are the security forces doing to try to find them and rescue them?
The military commanders on the ground have the coordinates where they believe that the bandits and whoever they are holding are. And they have surrounded all of that area. And there's a massive deployment of the army.
You call them bandits. Just to be clear about the motivation, is this about kidnap for money, or is there a religious Islamist element to this?
Well, the character of the criminality in these areas is a kidnap for ransom. If there are other motives, that probably will be found out when all of this is over.
Because if it is kidnapped for ransom, this is not the first time it's happened, and there's been a lot of anger about the fact that this has happened again, and that these are students who've been taken, and that the government isn't doing enough. What needs to be done then to prevent another incident like this and to protect young people?
The government is doing a lot. What needs to be done is that I think that the whole country needs to embrace the fact that security is supposed to be a matter for everyone. And that no matter the number of soldiers and policemen we have, they need the cooperation of local communities who must give intelligence. Because these criminals are not dropping from the moon. They are in our midst.
And in terms of this operation, this is, of course, President Buhari's home state. I mean, is he taking personal charge of this matter at the moment? Because he's there, isn't he?
President Buhari is being briefed hour after hour, and he's in touch with the governor. As I speak to you now, he's about meeting the state governor, and all hands are on deck to ensure that this is brought to an early end.
Right, but it's not working very well at the moment, is it? I mean, you've also got farmers who don't even want to go out into their fields because they're worried about being kidnapped as well.
Certainly, this is not the first manifestation of this sort of criminality in the country. We have had other incidents. We had the terrorists commanding an overwhelming presence in much of northern Nigeria. Now they are confined to largely one state, Borno, and that also is being finished. After that, we had the farmers and herders killing each other. This too we will overcome.
So just finally, what's your message to those families of students at the school who are still missing?
We feel their pains, and the government is concerned, and this is why you can see the overwhelming reaction coming from the government in the last 24 or so hours. The criminal elements, bandits, will be quashed. They will be eliminated.
Garba Shehu, spokesman for President Muhammadu Buhari. Let's talk to the BBC's Nigeria correspondent, Mayeni Jones, who joins us on the line from Lagos. Mayeni, good to have you with us. Just on the figures, what are you hearing? We heard Garba Shehu there just talking about, that it may be as few as 10 students are still missing. Is that likely?
I'm not sure where Mr. Shehu got that figure, but based on testimony that have been given by staff from the school, the number is believed to be much higher. But the reality is, as he said himself, it still needs to be verified. The situation is very murky on the ground. When these types of attacks happen, often, as you can imagine, in the panic, people, staff, students are fleeing into the bush and kind of staying hidden for a really long time. So it's possible that over the next 24 hours, more students will emerge. As you said, there's already 200 who've been found since then. But we believe from what we've heard from staff that the number is much higher and probably more likely to be in the hundreds.
And how much anger has this incident provoked in Nigeria?
I think the issue of security, it can't be said enough how big of an issue it is in Nigeria at the moment. It's one of the key concerns for Nigeria. President Buhari's administration has been facing increasing criticism over what many see here as its inability to get on top of the security situation, not just in northeastern Nigeria, where most of your listeners will be aware there have been a number of terror attacks recently, but the terror group Boko Haram and its affiliates, Islamic State West Africa Province, have been carrying out attacks there for decades, but also in other parts of the country. In the south, there continues to be attacks on installations, on oil installations down there, and in the northwest, there's increasing amounts of kidnapping for ransom. So the question of security, many here feel angered because they feel that the government isn't on top of it and keeps telling them that they have vanquished Boko Haram, mostly in Borno State in the northeast, and yet both Boko Haram and other violent actors continue to carry out attacks on ordinary Nigerians, seemingly every day.
Mayeni, thank you very much indeed. The BBC's Mayeni Jones joining us live on the line from Lagos. Now, The Danish Girl is the story of trans woman Lily Elbe, who in 1930 became one of the first people to undergo gender reassignment surgery. In 2015, it was made into a film starring the British actor Eddie Redmayne. Well, now the story's in the spotlight again after a performing arts company put out a casting ad looking specifically for a transgender artist to perform the lead role in a new dance production. Auditions have been held in Copenhagen, and our reporter Adrian Murray went along to find out more.
On the stage floor of an auditorium in central Copenhagen, a group of dancers are learning new steps.
Take your time here.
They're auditioning for the lead role in a new production of The Danish Girl. It's the story of Lily Elbe, a Danish painter and transgender woman who underwent one of the world's first sex reassignment surgeries.
Not so much time.
Now it's coming to the stage as a modern dance performance. David Price is the Associate Artistic Director of Black Box Dance Company and the show's producer.
It's a beautiful story about finding out who you are and growing into your own skin or struggling into your own skin under the pressures of society and based on the ideas of what a gender is and so on. So it's something that we felt would speak to people not just in Denmark but globally as well.
The lead role was advertised specifically for a transgender dancer. About 170 applications were received from all over the world. But with the current travel restrictions due to COVID-19, just a few finalists could make it to Copenhagen. 6 performers are here for 2 days of very intense auditions. The tasks include physically demanding dance exercises, but also intimate individual performances and interviews. Lily Elbe was born as a man called Einar Wagner and lived as an artist in Copenhagen and Paris. In 1930, Elbe underwent a series of pioneering surgeries, but later died of complications. A personal account of her transition was published as the book Man into Woman. This story was later fictionalized in the novel The Danish Girl by American writer David Ibershoff.
There was a moment when I wasn't me. There was a moment when I was just Lily.
In 2015, it was made into an award-winning film starring British actor Eddie Redmayne. However, the production was also criticised for its casting. When Black Box sought rights for the story, the author was keen that efforts be made to find a transgender performer.
Representation is important because people who have been portrayed on stages or in movies or in theaters or so on or in stores, they haven't had the control of their own narrative. And that's really something that we have to change, is the fact that people are not only seen in the characters that they were portrayed on stage, but they also have an influence on it.
It comes amid a growing focus on representation within the arts and entertainment industry.
Put away your glass slippers, Transarella. It ain't never gonna happen.
More transgender actors have been appearing on popular TV shows, such as Euphoria, Sense8, Orange is the New Black, and Pose. But when it comes to other performing arts like dance, such roles remain rare. Among those auditioning, Suki is a dancer and choreographer based in Berlin.
I trained in classical ballet since I'm 5 years old. It's part of me, part of my identity, but also as a trans artist, I found it very problematic because men and women are trained very differently. I find a lot of dance very binary, so I don't really fit. I've actually been waiting for this kind of moment in dance for a long time.
Holly has travelled from the UK for the auditions.
I've never seen a call out for trans experienced people, so that was a big thing. I think this is the beginning of the queer community being integrated with the whole dance community.
Shortly after the auditions, I caught up with Bjørk Munde, a Danish professional dancer who won the part. It's her first time stepping into a lead role.
I was not only applying for the role as Lily Elber, I was also applying to play Aina before she transitioned. And for me, that will be very, I think it will be an emotional experience to go into this part of her story.
Left arm up, stretch out.
The remaining dance ensemble is yet to be cast before rehearsals start next year. The production will premiere several months later in Vejle, the town where Lily Elber grew up.
Adrian Murray reporting there from Copenhagen in Denmark. Don't forget, on our top story, Brexit, there's lots more on our website, lots of explainers about what exactly is going to be happening at the end of the transition period, what might happen if Britain leaves without an agreement, and also more detail on some of the sticking points. It's all there, including a live page up and running with all the latest developments today, bbc.com/news. You're listening to NewsHour.
This is the BBC World Service with the story of China's rocket man.
Qian Jusen was the Chinese scientist who helped take 2 superpowers to the moon.
The status of a rocket in the 1930s, it's like the stuff of cranks and fantasists.
His story is one of technology and geopolitics, but also one of lies, persecution and betrayal.
America's actually deported the means by which one of their main communist rivals could develop their own space and missile program.
He was one of the most prominent scientists in the United States. He must have been really humiliated.
Expelled by his adopted country, embraced by the country of his birth.
It's clear that the engineering program that Qian started in China created missiles, derivatives of which have subsequently been fired back at the Americans.
China's rocket man at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
A reminder of our top story today on NewsHour. Britain and the European Union have agreed to continue talks on their post-Brexit trade relations, with both sides agreeing to go the extra mile to secure a deal. But our Brussels correspondent Kevin Connolly has been telling us why it was so hard to establish what that extra mile is and what is stopping them from reaching an agreement.
What exactly are the disputes over fisheries? What proportion of the European catch is the European side trying to maintain? What degree of divergence from future European rules might the UK want? They are the crucial issues which the negotiators are talking about. They're the technical issues which are being drilled into day after day, week after week in the talks, but not much at that level of detail is leaking into the public domain.
One other headline: Germany's tightening coronavirus restrictions to counter a surge in new infections. This is James Menendez with NewsHour. Now, there was good news on the pandemic earlier this week, with the first vaccinations against the virus here in the UK. Priority groups such as the elderly and health workers were given the first injection of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. The second will follow 3 weeks later, and combined, they offer up to 95% protection against COVID-19. Well, then on Friday night, the US Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, announced that it too was granting emergency approval to the same vaccine, which, according to President Trump, will be rolled out from this weekend. Canada, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia have also approved the drug for use, but there are worries about how many people will take it as it's rolled out more widely in the coming weeks and months. The concerns are manifold, but one you hear frequently is, how can we know it's safe when it's been rushed out so quickly? Meinrad Zimmermann in Switzerland shares that worry. He's an entrepreneur and lawyer by training. He used to work in the biotech industry, where he brought him together with Dr. Sarah Jarvis, a general practitioner here in the UK, to try to allay his fears.
There are 2 main reasons for giving vaccines. The first is to protect individual people, and the second is to protect the whole of society, to provide what we used to call herd immunity, what we now talk about as community immunity. What we do know is that it dramatically reduces the chance of you getting the infection with symptoms or becoming seriously unwell.
Meinrad Zimmermann, what are your concerns about this vaccine, and what's your main concern?
I mean, here in Switzerland, where I'm based, Swissmedic did not move further on with approval yet. And Pfizer, I mean, this was a couple of days ago, did not provide the data needed. So they just are stuck. They cannot move forward. All that I hear, like from clinical directors and managers, care home directors, managers, they all say no, because as far as we know now, it does not seem safe enough to us. So we do not have any information how safe it can be. RNA vaccines so far in history of RNA vaccine trials, even under animals, have been shown to be very problematic. In such a case of a new RNA vaccine, how can you come to the conclusion that this time it must be completely safe after such a short time?
Myrad, you also seem to be sort of hinting that you were worried that the testing process had run too fast, that there was no way that the vaccine could be tested to be safe in such a short time. Is that fair?
Usually to get a vaccine to approval would be shortest 5, 10, maybe 15 years in a completely new class of vaccine. In such a short time to do an experiment by poor common sense, I think I would never take this risk. How can you feel safe about this?
Okay, well let's deal with that with Sarah Jarvis. Have corners been cut in the testing trialling process?
Corners have categorically not been cut. There are lots of reasons why, as Meinrad said, it normally takes so many years. Actually, that is not to do with long-term side effects. It's to do with the process. For a start, you need to get the genetic fingerprint of the virus that you're working on. In this case, it was made available to the entire world's scientific community freely in January as soon as it was isolated. Secondly, one of the biggest delays in terms of getting a vaccine out there is getting funding. In this case, there was no problem getting funding. The third thing is, once you get there, you need to get ethical vaccine, and to do that, you have to have the technology available. We have been working on mRNA vaccines. We've been working on so-called vector vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, for many years. As I say, the RNA vaccine has been trialled in cancer and in infectious diseases.
To compare a melanoma vaccine or RNA mechanism, melanoma is almost certain death, as we know, and there something may be seen as safe in clinical data. The figure is much, much, much easier, even when you have adverse side effects, than for a vaccine which you roll out to the majority of the public. You cannot compare this in safety studies, as you know.
No, but for instance, when we look at any other vaccine, the side effects come are not because they're long-term or short-term side effects. The problems with side effects come either because they're common in the studies or they are uncommon, in which they're very much less likely to be picked up until a lot of people have been vaccinated. It's not about the length of time.
Another thing that has been raised by people is the issue of several deaths during the trial that some people have identified as a problem, and also allergic reactions. Can you deal with that?
In terms of the deaths during the trials, interestingly, the only death that was seen during the trial was actually somebody who turned out, I believe, not to be on the vaccine side. There have been, for instance, in the Oxford AstraZeneca version, there were some 175 potential significant reactions found, but we need to remember that these are blinded trials, so nobody knows whether the patient is in the real thing or the other one. And when the researchers, and these are completely independent researchers, looked at them, they found only 3 out of the 175 potential significant adverse reactions could be potentially attributable to the vaccine. They then drilled down further and found that one of those 3 was a case of fever, which had settled on its own. So it was defined because of the criteria as a significant adverse event, but was of no significant consequence. Every side effect is looked at really, really carefully.
One very important point which I see is very critical. I mean, when you look at the money, you see what people really mean. When it's about the money, you see the truth. If you, like the NHS or the approval body in the UK and Pfizer, BioNTech, are completely convinced that this study is so safe, it's half or even whole population, without any problem, how can you say, when it's so harmless, why do you give indemnification?
So this is the issue of the UK government indemnifying Pfizer, essentially protecting it from being sued in case of longer-term complications.
Because it is absolutely safe. This is not necessary, and it will help to build up trust in the population by not indemnifying.
Okay, well, let's Sarah respond to that. I mean, that might sort of smell a bit funny to some people. What's going on?
No medicine is entirely without risk. People are allergic to penicillin. People die from penicillin allergy. Nobody is saying should stop giving anybody antibiotics ever because of the 1 in a million chance that somebody will die from an adverse reaction. It was 2 patients who died in the vaccine arm. One of them died from arteriosclerosis, a heart attack in other words. One died from cardiac arrest. Now, we were giving these vaccines to people who are at high risk already. And in the placebo arm, 4 people died. When we are doing a study which lasts several months on patients at high risk like this, we would expect that sort of number of people to die, because in the general population, and indeed in the placebo group, that's what happens over the course of a few months.
Dr. Sarah Jarvis talking with Meinrad Zimmermann in Switzerland. That brings us to the end of this edition of News Hour. From me and the rest of the team here in London, thanks so much for being with us. Until the next time, take care. Bye-bye.
This is the BBC World Service, where the story of the anti-government protests in Belarus continues.
For over 100 days, Alexander Lukashenko has faced mass demonstrations against his 26-year rule. These are the stories of the protesters who no longer recognize him as their president.
Every time we go out to protest, we are really afraid.
Belarus across the barricades at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in an hour, The Forum with Bridget Kendall.
The Egyptian singer Kulthum was a powerful performer and strong supporter of pan-Arab nationalism. In her heyday, she enthralled audiences both in Egypt and across the Middle East. So how did she manage to capture so many hearts?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news, The Big Idea, examining 5 questions, all linked to life in the city. First, what's the appeal of cities? Second, does non-violent protest work?
If a mass movement comes to include a broad segment of society, it starts to just look like their family, friends, and so forth. They may even recognize their family and friends in the movement and decide that they don't want to shoot these people.
Our third question, how can we stop rogue cops? Question 4, what's the link between culture and whether people follow the rules? And finally, how do we stop the next pandemic?
The first cases that we detect are by nature the most severe cases, because those are the ones that come to medical attention.
All questions to be answered in the BBC's Big Idea with me, David Edmonds. After this summary of news.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Britain and the European Union have agreed to extend talks on a post-Brexit trade deal, with an end-of-year deadline looming before Britain leaves the EU's single market and customs union. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said she and Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson had agreed in a phone call to go the extra mile. Rob Watson has more on the decision.
It's not entirely clear whether they've decided to continue talking because maybe, just maybe, they can bridge the gaps between them, or whether it's because both the European Union and the UK are immensely reluctant, for very understandable reasons, to be seen to be the ones walking away and saying, right, that's it, no deal it is. Also, a no deal outcome would, I think, leave the UK very isolated on the world stage. I'm not sure that many people, certainly not the United States, its incoming president, would be very thankful to the UK if there was a no deal.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has welcomed the decision to continue to talk to Britain. Her comments were echoed by the Foreign Minister of Ireland, the EU country that would be hardest hit by a no-deal Brexit. But Simon Coveney also warned reaching a deal would be difficult. Chancellor Angela Merkel has agreed to tighter coronavirus lockdown with regional leaders that will apply across Germany over the holiday period. Schools and non-essential shops will close from Wednesday and remain shut until at least the 10th of January. Jenny Hill reports from Berlin.
Angela Merkel has for months urged Germany's regional leaders to impose harsher restrictions. And this morning, as the number of infections and deaths continues to rise, they finally agreed. Non-essential shops, schools and hairdressers will shut on Wednesday. Pubs, restaurants, arts and leisure facilities were closed last month as part of a so-called lockdown light, which Mrs Merkel said hadn't done enough to bring the second wave under control. Germany is all but cancelling Christmas. Festivities will be restricted to small family gatherings, and with a ban on alcohol consumption outdoors, even the traditional mulled wine stalls will have to close.
The Afghan Defence Ministry says more than 60 Taliban fighters have been killed in fierce fighting with security forces in the southern province of Kandahar. The two sides are involved in peace negotiations. Here's our South Asia editor, Anbarasan Etirajan.
The Afghan security forces have launched a heavy air and ground assault to repel Taliban advances in at least 5 districts surrounding the city of Kandahar. Local residents said the fighting continued several hours through the night. The Defense Ministry says Taliban has suffered heavy losses, but there are no details of government casualties. Elsewhere in Kandahar, in the district of Argandab, residents said at least 7 members of a family, including 4 children, were killed in airstrikes. On Saturday, several rockets hit the capital Kabul, killing 1 person and disrupting operations at the international airport for a few hours.
World News from the BBC. The Nigerian presidential spokesman has said that troops are surrounding the area where gunmen are believed to be holed up, along with an unknown number of abducted schoolchildren. Garba Shehu said he'd been told 10 pupils were still being held hostage, though teachers in Katsina State say they think the number is much higher. Protests are continuing in Belarus, demanding the resignation of the country's long-standing authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukashenko. Small groups have gathered in different parts of the capital, Minsk, a contrast to the large-scale marches seen in the first months of protests. The demonstration started in August after a presidential election that has been widely denounced as rigged. An anti-government march is making its way through the Polish capital Warsaw on the anniversary of the communist authorities declaring martial law in the 1980s. The demonstrators are trying to reach the home of the country's most powerful politician, the right-wing nationalist Jarosław Kaczyński. Many are carrying Polish, EU and rainbow flags and banners for women's rights. Mr. Kaczynski's Law and Justice Party has in effect banned abortions and attacked LGBT rights. Malaysia's maritime agency says it has intercepted the country's largest ever haul of crystal meth, seizing tens of millions of dollars worth of the drug from a speedboat. With more, here's Celia Hatton.
Malaysia's Coast Guard officers say they spotted a boat off northern Penang State that was making some erratic movements. After a 30-minute chase, the driver of the boat jumped overboard and was then arrested. On board, officers discovered more than $26 million worth of crystal meth hidden inside packets of Chinese tea they believe came from Myanmar. It's the largest ever seizure by Malaysia's maritime agency, but drug enforcement experts believe the region's powerful drug syndicates, which operate between China, Southeast Asia and Australia, will quickly fill the gap left by the seizure.
BBC News.
Hi, I'm David Edmonds of the BBC World Service, and this is The Big Idea. I found the most fascinating ideas around and the people who thought them up, and I'm going to do my best to explain them. In this, the second of 3 one-hour programmes, I'll be looking at 5 separate but interconnected ideas about the city. Why do most people live in cities, and what does this mean for the way we live? I'll be drawing on the ideas of 5 leading thinkers, the first of whom was intrigued by this question: how many people does it take to topple a dictator?
Freedom, yes. Apartheid, no. Freedom, yes. Apartheid, no.
Unlike unpopular democratic governments, dictators can't be voted out. But there are other ways to oppose them. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth studies opposition to dictatorship, comparing violent resistance to non-violent. In recent history, there have been many non-violent movements.
So this would include, say, the Solidarity movement in Poland against communist rule there in the 80s. It would include the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, but it would also include the movement against Augusto Pinochet in Chile. It would include movements in the Arab awakenings, like the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia. More recent examples would include the Sudan Revolution of 2019, the Algerian Revolution of 2019 as well, often called the Smile Revolution, and even a movement against a corrupt and misogynistic governor in Puerto Rico in 2019 in July.
If you missed that one, the Puerto Rican governor Ricardo Rossello was forced to resign. Leaked homophobic and misogynistic remarks, and remarks which made fun of victims of Hurricane Maria, prompted huge demonstrations. Soon we'll hear which works best, violence or non-violence. But demonstrations are only one form of non-violent protest. There are petitions and posters, strikes and boycotts, sit-ins and walkouts. Indeed, according to one well-known protest classification, there are 198 forms of non-violent protest. Not that the distinction between violence and non-violence is always clear-cut. Professor Chenoweth describes 3 types of protest, which are not so easily pigeonholed.
The first would be an unarmed event where people are actually expressing hateful or discriminatory or dispossessive aims.
Think of a neo-Nazi demo.
The other grey area would be more about the means themselves, so property destruction is sometimes a grey area, although I think most activists would not include that in their definition of violence because it's often symbolic. It's meant to convey the seriousness of the goal without physically hurting anyone. And then there's also self-harm, so things like self-immolation or hunger strikes, which cause harm to the self but not to others.
Nonetheless, most forms of protest are either patently violent, like assassinations, or patently non-violent, such as a vigil or a march. Professor Chenoweth's research aimed to answer a simple question. If a movement wanted to achieve a certain goal, such as toppling a dictator, what strategy was most likely to work, violence or non-violence? With a colleague, she studied every protest movement on which there was sufficient data, starting in 1900, all the way to 2006. And
nonviolent campaigns succeeded about half the time, and violent campaigns succeeded about a quarter of the time.
To put it another way, a movement was twice as likely to be successful if it was non-violent. The next question is, why? Well, the main reason appears to be that violence reduces a movement's support base. In contrast, many more people will actively join non-violent protests.
So in general, on average, nonviolent campaigns are able to garner more participation than violent campaigns because it's easier to participate in most nonviolent methods. It's more convenient to participate. Generally speaking, it's lower risk. It requires less physical ability. It requires less advanced training. And that means that many of the methods of nonviolent action are accessible. So you tend to see much higher participation rates among women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, other people who've been marginalized in the population, precisely because the methods of nonviolent action, like a demonstration, are just easier for people to participate in with lower risk to themselves and their futures than armed campaigns.
Terrorist groups and assassination squads tend not to be populated by septuagenarian or octogenarian grandparents. Non-violent campaigns are a different matter.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, in Serbia, during the bulldozer revolution, which was trying to oust Slobodan Milosevic in the late 90s and 2000, there was a particular tactic called grandparents' protests. The youth, kind of the main cohort mobilizing this uprising, would get their grandparents to come and stand on either side of them because